Now, we're through really with looking at preliminary matters. We've looked thus far at the term diaspora. What does the term diaspora mean? We've looked at the land promises given to Abraham. We've looked at the plurality of dispersions. These are just kind of some headlines and highlights of the messages that we've done thus far. We've looked at the extent of the diaspora in the first century. And we have just completed looking at the lands. By extent, I meant in numbers. Extent now geographically, the lands of the diaspora where these Jews are. Now, do you think you're getting a good picture in your mind? The more complete and round this picture is, you can't just say one or two things or a sentence or two or a couple of verses to prove something. The more complete your picture is, the more you can feel what's going on. Now, I know we haven't gotten specific enough in, let's say, maybe thought patterns or daily life for you to really feel the ethos of the Jewish people in the diaspora. But that's certainly the place to which we're headed. The better grasp you have on that, then, and this is what's so necessary when anyone is learning anything, this business of multiple choice, that's just for the birds. The only way to go is essay, as far as I'm concerned. That proves you know what you're talking about then. Anyone can multiply guesses to the end of the paper. Essay is another thing. Essay means you might not be able to remember all of those dates and all of those specifics, which is what multiple choice is always after. In what year did your grandmother give birth to the 19th child of hers? You can't remember all of those things, but essay means you could say, now I'm going to describe to you what happened to the Jews according to the prediction of Moses the prophet. And you go through this business of how they sinned and how God scattered them and how many Jews there were, relatively speaking. Now, there were not as many here as down here, and I will tell you why. And you might not remember the name of the city, but you know the general area, and you know how to discuss that. Now I want to actually start getting into some of the important mechanics of the diaspora. Remember, I said, what did I say? 30 messages in this study? I can't even remember what I said now. So we still have a long way to go, getting into the actual mechanics of the diaspora and how important it is for an understanding of the New Testament, Jewish history and the New Testament. Important mechanics by asking such questions as, what were the Jews of the diaspora like? I mean, we know what they were like in the Old Testament if we study carefully the documents of the prophets. We can put together a fairly reliable scenario of just what the Jewish people were like. What were they like in the diaspora? Did it, and if so, where? Did it differ from the Jews of Palestine? That is an important question. Palestinian versus diasporous Jewry and its constitution or composition. How did their surroundings affect them? What was their relationship to Palestinian Jewry? I said earlier, did they differ, and if so, where? Well, what is their relationship? Let's say they don't differ. Well, still, what is their relationship with Palestinian Jewry? What are their religious beliefs? See, that's where it's really going to get important. What are their religious beliefs? Do they still believe the law and the prophets? Do they believe any more, any less? Do they believe like the Jews in Palestine do concerning religious topics? The law and the prophets? What is this business that we see so often of proselytism? How in the world did that begin with the Jewish people? Proselytism, the making of proselytes. And how does that affect our understanding of New Testament early Christianity? Proselytism is a huge study that we were going to be so exhaustive on. It's exciting how exhaustive we'll be on proselytism. That's going to answer many questions and prove many different points for early Christianity, and by extension, what those implications might be for us today. Some of our discussion will touch on the outlines next point, ITP outline, but I'm going to have a lot of additional things for that as well. Let's get into some of the mechanics of what life is like for the diaspora Jews. If I had to pick one word to sum up what life was like for a Jew of the diaspora, well, I know what I would pick. What would you pick? All right, now that's one of those, that raises, well, say it or don't say it. That's going to fit back into this question of the relationship or the differences between Palestinian Jewry and the Jewry out here in the larger world. Other words, materialistic. To pick one word to sum up them and their life. I've got a word that's before that word, that's more basic than that word. Worldly. Now I'm a little no, I'm not surprised. I'm glad that you're saying this, and I'm not saying that it's wrong, but look how you're all thinking. You're thinking, well, these rotten Jews out here, they got so far away from their homeland, and they should have gone back to Jerusalem and settled around Judea, and here they are up here having a good time in Corinth and Rome, these apostates. Now see, that's a train of thought already. I don't know. We're gonna be looking at that. That's good. See, you've got a thought. Hopefully you're not an empty head, a raka of Matthew 5. You got a thought. Either they're pagans, or they're middle of the road, or they're good Jews, or something. And most of you are saying they're pagans out here. They've forsaken Moses and the law, worldly, materialistic things out there.
Hellenistic?
Okay, Hellenistic.
They wanted something to unify themselves with all the rest of the Jews everywhere else.
Such as what?
Rule book, and they had new writing so that they could.
Okay, you're going to try to make them more observant of the laws then, more orthodox?
Some unifying so that they would be the same. So they all would be the same, and they had little rules of when there would be certain communities that would start to grow, and then they would then announce time to have a school, and now it's time to have a synagogue.
Do you think that that they are going to be similar then to the Jews in Palestine?
They want to be similar with all the rest that were over everywhere else.
Oh, similar just with the diaspora
I
Jew.
don't know.
Okay, that's an idea. Because I think, if I understand what you're saying correctly, you're trying to work in some type of religious good point for the people. So that's a little bit different than this whole group. This is negative right here.
More orthodox and legalistic.
More orthodox as far as
As opposed to being legalistic.
as far as how we would interpret orthodoxy for the diaspora Jews. Maybe not necessarily as orthodox as the Palestinian Jews.
Wasn't fear the basis for all those
The negative things? Okay. That goes a little bit earlier then than these terms. I mean, I'm sure anyone could select a word and it could be appropriate and approved. I think I've got a better term than these terms thus far, though. Materialism, worldly, Hellenistic, all caused by fear. Jews of the diaspora are trying to, they want to maintain some type of identity, and so they have to have some focal point of unification.
Self-sufficient.
Okay. Self-sufficient. You mean self-sufficient so that the Jews can stay together and they don't have to have too much interaction with the surrounding Gentile community?
Well, with Jerusalem, they don't need their homeland as far as being separate from the Holy Land.
Okay, they don't need their homeland. Okay. Self-sufficient from Jerusalem. Do you see them interacting a lot with their Gentile neighbors? Are they isolated and self-sufficient from them too? You s-
They have synagogues, but they just don't let all the Gentiles supply.
Okay, good. So you're thinking.
They became good at finance. Maybe not then, but maybe later.
Ah.
Good at
So we're up here to this
where they
materialism.
live.
Okay, that they became the bankers and the leaders of the world. Okay.
They were welcome some places.
And then you said that maybe not at this time.
Well, maybe later.
Any earlier?
I don't know.
That's a question we'll discuss, this business of finances and when was it? So that was very good. Next time, as a matter of fact. Next message will be to this question right here, which will cover some of these questions here as well. Okay, did I chew up enough time now? I don't need to because I've got a lot to say. The word that I would pick would be this word. Title of the message, High Tensions in the Diaspora. High tensions in the diaspora. And this will fit some of what you've said, or at least it's the background for some of what you've said. This one word can probably sum up the experience of the diaspora Jew, tension. They felt a certain tension being a Jew in a non-Jewish land. That means if my interpretation of the materials is correct, that means let's not take this too far, this business of worldliness and so forth, because worldliness means you just surrender your Jewish identity and just join in with the rest. There's a tension, a very noticeable tension of being a Jew in a non-Jewish land. Now, if you just want to be materialistic and worldly, you're not a Jew and you don't care where you live. You're just there to live the, quote, good life. That's going too far, if my interpretation of the materials is correct. There's always two groups of Jews out here. There are always two different groups, just like there are two different groups in the church and maybe to a slight degree two different groups here. There are those more and those less influenced by their environment. A lot of that is just determined by the strength of the individual's own convictions. There are those more and those less influenced by their environment. Therefore, those more, those less, worldly, Hellenistic, Orthodox, those more Orthodox, those less Orthodox, materialistic, and so forth. The ethos of some particular countries assimilated them more readily and easily than other countries. You see, that had nothing to do with who the Jewish people were, what they were like. That had only to do with the ethos of the country under consideration. And I'm saying that the ethos of one country might more readily assimilate the Jewish people than the ethos of another country. So the fault of assimilation in that country may not necessarily lie 100% at the doorway of the Jewish individual. Partly there, but partly just because there's some type of link or identification with that society as it already exists. I think the same is true with 20th century Jewish diaspora as well. And if you study some of the materials of the scattering of the Jews after and during and after the Second World War, you see that some countries just assimilated the Jewish people more readily than other countries. Some countries, just by nature of the ethos of the people, they could not be assimilated, and so they more or less stayed to themselves. They kept those distinct settlements, and they kept those distinct communities. And then you might find divisions within one single country, where part of the country would assimilate them more readily than another. I mean, how often have you just been out there in the working world or the shopping world or something, just run across a Jew, and you didn't know he was a Jew from everyone else around? He just was assimilated right into the culture and the community here. And then maybe other places, the Jews live on streets where other Jews live. So you can find right here in this country divisions like that. The Jews just live together. Other places, the Jews live everywhere. They don't live together in a community. Not that they're a commune, they just try to live close together. They don't live like that. They just live scattered out. But why this tension? What was so wrong with being influenced by your new adopted homeland? Well, this finally gets us to the very reason for their tension. Historically and theologically, the Jews have been nonconformists. Historically and theologically, the Jews have been nonconformists, which then produced tension both from within and from without. And we'll break that down here in a few moments and look from within and from without. Let's look at a few scripture references here first of all. This is a big statement. Historically and theologically, the Jews have been nonconformists. A nonconformist is the direct opposite of a compromiser. Now in Exodus, now this doesn't really speak to the matter, but it certainly shows theologically that God's desire was that there be a very absolute division between his people and the Egyptians. Exodus chapter 8, verses 22 and 23. And this is seen right in the historical narrative of the plagues being sent on Egypt. Do you remember so many times, especially as we get toward the middle and the end of these plagues, that God would send plagues, and in the first plagues it doesn't specify that he's going to put a division between the Egyptians and his people. But as we go along, we find there's a division. We find that he sends darkness throughout all the land of Egypt except for the houses in Goshen, which is where the Israelites lived. They had light in their dwelling places, and all the rest of Egypt lived in darkness. God put a very distinct division between them to show them, through the historical narrative, that theologically and practically and ethically and morally they were to be different, nonconformists, different from, separate than, divided from all of the other peoples around them. I will sever, Exodus 8:22, in that day the land of Goshen in which my people dwell. Now this isn't Goshen, Indiana. This is Goshen, Egypt here. That's Mennonite headquarters if you go into Goshen, Indiana. Goshen College is there. But no swarms of flies shall be there, to the end thou mayest know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth, and I will put a division between my people and thy people. Tomorrow shall this sign be. Chapter 9 and verse 4. The Lord shall sever between the cattle of Israel and the cattle of Egypt, and there shall nothing die of all that is the children's of Israel. Verse 6, and the Lord did that thing on the morrow, and all the cattle of Egypt died, but of the cattle of the children of Israel died not one. He puts a division, and if you put a division, that means that whoever's on the right side is forbidden to conform to those that are on the wrong. Verse 26, so there was hail and fire mingled with hail, very grievous, such as there was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. I'm a little bit earlier here. And the hail smote throughout all the land of Egypt, all that was in the field, both man and beast. And the hail smote every herb of the field and brake every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, there was no hail. 10:23, they saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days, Egyptians, because of the darkness. But all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. Now he gets more specific. chapter 11, verses 6 and 7. So just saying that I divided and you experienced this and you didn't, there shall be a great crying throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there was none like it, nor shall be like it any more. But against any of the children of Israel shall not a dog move his tongue against man or beast, that ye may know how that the Lord doth put a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. Now it's no longer, now it takes on, a personal, a salvific sense here. No longer is it just, I'm going to put a difference geographically or as far as judgment is concerned, so that judgment is sent on one and not judgment on another. But why is that done? Well, again, because God has put a division, because he loves Israel and because he hates Egypt. So now we have a salvific theological meaning behind this. In Leviticus 18, watch this long passage, verses 24 through 30. He's talking to them about when they come into the land, that is, when they come into the land of Palestine. Leviticus 18:24. Defile not ye yourselves in any of these things, for in all these the nations are defiled, which I cast out before you. The land is defiled, therefore I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land itself vomiteth out its inhabitants, her inhabitants. Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nation, nor any stranger that sojourneth among you. For all these abominations have the men of the land done, which were before you, and the land is defiled. That the land spew not you out also, when ye defile it, as it spewed out the nations that were before you. And then we have that passage in Deuteronomy 18 and verse 9, speaking of all of the sins of the occult. And listen to what God said through Moses to them. When you come into the land which the Lord gives you, you shall not learn to do after the abominations of those nations. There it is, Deuteronomy 18:9, summed up in one verse of the non-conformist doctrine that God leveled on his people, that they were bound to practice. Now, this remains true throughout Israel's history, even when she's in a period of discipline in the diaspora. When you come into the land which the Lord your God giveth you, and just because now you've gone out from the land into the diaspora doesn't mean you can disobey the second half of this verse. Thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of those nations. What does that speak of but nonconformity? And then what does nonconformity speak of? Whenever you are a people bound to a book, and yet you're living in the midst of other heathens. But tension. If this verse speaks of nonconformity, nonconformity speaks of high tensions in the diaspora then. As we shall see later on, by the way, the same tensions that the Christian experiences while living in this world. The exact same principle is applicable for him, because he's living, as we'll see later, far away from his home as well. Our citizenship is in heaven. So the exact same principle is here. Whatever is considered of God an abomination of this nation, and he goes on to list just, a few of them in the realm of the occult here, then he said, I forbid you to practice that or to participate in that. The same is true for the Christian. He must be separate and he must be distinct. Now, I said earlier that the tension was from both within and without. Let's break this up and we'll discuss this. The tension being from within, which I would describe like this. And you'll see the same thing in your own life as a Christian. Tension over adherence to the Torah and life in the real world of a foreign country. See, in other words, I'll say that again if you want to listen and then you can get that down again. In other words, that's why I go earlier in these words, tension. In other words, worldliness. Well, not just they became worldly, but tension over the whole thing. What starts before you become worldly? The tension. You know that you're not supposed to live like these other nations around you. And before you do start living like them, if you do, some don't. But even for those that don't start living and compromising, there's tension. Even if you don't compromise into materialism and Hellenism, there's still tension there, being a Jew in a non-Jewish land, being a person of a book, one who wants to adhere to the Torah of Moses, and yet you're living in a foreign, Gentile, pagan, evil country. Then there's tension over, in other words, if you're living back here in Palestine, you're constantly having other Jewish and religious support. You have a whole host of support systems around you. All of your neighbors and all of your friends and all of your customers and your employer and your employees and your local church, synagogue, everyone around you are fellow Jews who believe in the same book that you believe in. That's what we call a support system. It's much easier to live in an environment like that when you have support systems galore around you, so that if you start to stumble, well, then it's Ecclesiastes, chapter 3 there. 2 are better than 1. If one stumbles, there's one there to lift up the one that stumbles. You've got that whole support system around you. Now, what if you live up here in foreign Italy or Spain or Portugal or something? Well, then that brings up the question, how communal was the arrangement of the Jews then? Surely they could see that support systems were very necessary to keep them on the straight and narrow way. So it would make sense then, logically, that they would just isolate themselves in one small community and have little or no dealings with anyone else around them. That way, essentially, you've got Jerusalem transplanted to Rome, because you have your own little Jewish community there centered around a synagogue and a rabbi who leads a synagogue. But what if our studies and the materials and the documents, what if our study does not prove that to be true? Well, then the Jews are going to have a lot of problems, because then they're trying to live as an individual Jew without the support system, or without that much of a support system in a Gentile pagan area. And the tension that you experience, you're going to very, very, very soon surrender into compromise. Rather than being a nonconformist, you'll be one that conforms to those around. You experience that as one who adheres to the teachings of Christ, and yet you don't live in heaven. You won't have any tension there, because there are not two forces pulling you in opposite directions. When you live here in this world, you've got two forces pulling you in opposite directions. The world is trying to pull you in one direction. The laws and teachings of your Lord is leading you in another. And there's tension then. You want to follow Christ, and yet the world sometimes is very appealing. Those less easily assimilated into any of these foreign countries were those more religiously observant. That makes sense. There was tension over adherence to the Torah and life in the real world of a foreign country, and those less easily assimilated were those more religiously observant. That says something about your own life then. The better the support system, James 1, the more observant you are of the teachings of your Lord, the less easily you can be assimilated into this world. Simply because your adherence to the teachings of Christ is like surrounding yourself with armor. Ephesians 6, 10 to 18. And the armor repels the attraction of the world, the easy assimilation into the customs of the world. We're not going to go too far into Christian applications of this, but you'll just have to think on your own, and hopefully the Holy Spirit will show this to you privately and individually, how the same is precisely true for the Christian in this life. Exactly what the Jews are experiencing. It's almost like, and we'll get to these verses later, but it's almost like the diaspora is kind of a spiritual type, a historical example for the Christian church afterwards. Here the Jews are living with high tensions in the diaspora, trying to stay faithful to the law, or wanting, let's say, to stay faithful to the law, and yet finding it increasingly difficult living in a foreign land. The same is true with you as a believer. And think of this thought. Much of the Torah for the Jews of the diaspora is simply irrelevant and impossible to fulfill. I mean, the Torah, the law was given to a wandering, nomadic Jewish people while they were spending 38 years in the desert. And so much about the cult and the liturgy and all of the sacrifices and all of that business is no longer relevant, and it's impossible to fulfill for these Jews who live scattered all over the world. What then does that do to your perception of your scriptures as your final source of authority? But that it must be diminished as being your final source of authority, and will have to have something in its place, such as the rabbinical courts and Jewish casuistry. And how true is that for the Christian? All right, we don't live in the days of the apostles anymore. We don't live in the first century. Now, how much of the New Testament really is for me then? And then before you know it, the commentators say, well, now, you see, it's impossible for us to experience those things anymore. And those teachings, like on the gifts of the Holy Spirit, those are irrelevant for us today. And so the New Testament's supreme place of authority in the Christian life loses its distinction.
That's right.
And we have the views of the commentators multiplied time and time again upon our head. The Jews experience the exact same thing. How are you going to go through all the sacrifice? And I mean, some of them tried to get back to Jerusalem, the more religiously observant, but that was difficult to do. There were 3 annual feasts, and it was a law of God that the males over 20 years of age had to appear those 3 times a year. Why, not 1 in 100,000 went back 3 times a year from Spain? Come on, that's impossible. Not 1 in 100,000 went back 3 times a year from Spain? Come on, that's impossible. Not when it would take you 2 months to get there, 2 months back, multiply that by 3, well, that takes your whole year. That's 4 months. 2 there, 2 back, 3 trips there. That's 12 months. So they picked one Passover, some of them, and tried to make it to that. Well, you just violated the law. If you're a male Israelite over the age of 20, you have to be back for Pentecost and for Tabernacles as well. So how are you going to justify that then? See what I'm talking about? Tension. How are you going to justify that? Living out there, except somehow you have to say, now that was a law for a certain period in our history, and we just can't perform that, and God understands we can't perform that anymore. That's a very interesting question in Jewish history. What did God think about the Jews living up in Spain and Italy, who made it back once a year, who made it back once every 2 or 3 years, who made it back once a lifetime? They took a Mecca pilgrimage back once during their life to fulfill the requirements of being in the holy city. What did God think of that? Would he just allow that to pass over? I mean, after all, the Old Testament has been fulfilled now in Jesus Christ. So how applicable are those laws now that we're into New Testament dispensation in the period of grace? Of course, what would come to my mind is one way you could solve the whole business of whether this is applicable. It's just move back to Israel. If you move back to Israel, you solved all your questions then, at least as long as the temple is still standing. And then once the temple is destroyed, now you got a whole new set of problems. Because now, regardless of where you live, sacrifice is irrelevant and impossible. You see, a lot of accumulation of these things made Christianity appealing to some of the Jews. As you go through these periods, you see Judaism as we know it from the teachings of Moses and the prophets is, they might have thought, coming to an end. We would qualify that, or better state that, is fulfilled in Christianity. It doesn't really come to an end. It is fulfilled in Christianity. And especially if you're a Jew and you watch the fall of your city, that sacrifice, as you know, was the heart of the Old Testament. The sacrificial ritual was just the heart of their service to God. If you have no temple, you cannot offer sacrifice. Then what do you do as a Jew? Best thing to do is convert to Christianity, so that you can look back on one sacrifice, that of Christ, as being applicable for the rest of your life. So they see these problems of the Torah being irrelevant and new substitutions are invented, and we'll look at some of those new substitutions later on. All of the various laws and bylaws and under laws and beside laws and over and above laws that were invented to help build up the superstructure of their religious ship. That's tension from within. You want to serve God and follow the Torah. You find it increasingly difficult, if not impossible. Secondly, tension from without. Tension from without. Not speaking of the Jew, now speaking of their Gentile neighbors. Who likes to live around religious nonconformists who always are acting as though they are holier than thou? That would bring tension from without. Tension from within because of your conscience and the teachings of the law. Tension from without because of your Gentile neighbors. Who likes to live around a religious nonconformist who's always acting and talking and feeling as though he's superior to you? That to me speaks of persecution. Nonconformists will be persecuted. The Jews experienced it. Jesus and the apostles predicted that for the church. 2 Timothy 3:12, yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus, that means you're nonconformist, shall suffer persecution. 2 Timothy 3:12. So, this brought on them persecution known in history as anti-Semitism. The tension from without, the dislike of Gentile neighbors brought persecution in the form of anti-Semitism. I have volumes on this topic at home, so realize that it is a complex study in itself through history. But we have very much evidence for a widespread, latent anti-Semitism in the first century Roman world. Much evidence for this, for a widespread, latent anti-Semitism in the first century Roman world. Now, if you're thinking, how could you write volumes on anti-Semitism? All that's talking about is that, people don't like Jews. That's the whole thing. Why is it people don't like Jews? Why is it they pick Jews out? What is it about a Jew that people don't like? They like Swedish people and British people and Italians. Why is it if Jews live in America, we don't like them? If they live in Great Britain, they don't like them. If they live in Sweden, they don't like them. If they live in Italy, they don't like them. Now I realize that Americans can go to some third world countries and they hate us because we're capitalistic pigs, and expansionists as far as colonial concerns matter. But that's not the same as the Jewish people. Why anti-Semitism? I mean, the whole psychology behind anti-Semitism is a question, as I say, in itself. But I'm saying that we've got very much evidence for widespread, latent anti-Semitism in the first century Roman world. For instance, Horace, Juvenal, Cicero, and Tacitus, the Roman writers, all speak negatively and derisively of Jews. Horace, Juvenal, Cicero, Tacitus. Just spell them the best that you can. You probably know how anyway. Horace, Juvenal, Cicero, and Tacitus. All speak negatively, derisively about the Jewish people. Now, I will give you the references and the quotes from them in a later message. This is a study where many things are interconnected, and I have to come back to that. You just jot that down now, and I'll give you exactly what those men said later. Popular uprisings against them in Rome and other cities are well documented. I think on at least one occasion earlier I pointed this out. Let's turn to Acts 16, verses 19 through 24. We've got at least two well-known examples in the New Testament of a latent, you know what latent means? It's lying just under the surface. And it's just waiting for something to tick it off. And we have it here in Acts 16. We'll have it again in Acts chapter 18. Acts 16, 19 through 24. Paul and them have cast the spirit out of this girl. And when her masters saw that the hope of their gains was gone, they caught Paul and Silas and drew them into the marketplace unto the rulers and brought them to the magistrates, saying, now they're upset, no question about the fact, because of an economic, financial loss here. But according to Luke's narrative, that's not all. I mean, that was the spark that ticked off the beneath the surface latent anti-Semitism, was the fact that they're going to suffer financial loss. But notice what they say. Notice the way they phrase it. These men being Jews. Now, if it would have been someone from another city or just another country, they wouldn't say, now this fella from 1914 Wood Avenue, they're not going to specify that. What they're concerned about is this person has caused me a loss of financial gain. That's part of the problem here. That's what sparks off the problem. Underneath the surface, what do we find hidden there? But a latent form of anti-Semitism. These men, being Jews, do exceedingly trouble our city, and teach customs which are not lawful for us to receive, neither to observe, being Romans. And of course, you know what happens. They're beaten as a result. And look with me in chapter 18. This is a very interesting account. Well, there's two accounts here, excuse me. There are two accounts in chapter 18. That gives us three total then. I'd forgotten I've got these verses separated because they're two separate occurrences. Verse 2. After these things Paul departed from Athens, came to Corinth, and in Corinth he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus. Now how did he get here in Corinth? Lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, and Luke adds his historical note, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome. There's a form of anti-Semitism right there. From the capital city of the empire, banning all Jews from living there. That means scores of thousands of Jews had to leave. Then a different account, but here in the same chapter, verses 12 through 17. Now, Paul is stirring up matters because he's preaching in the synagogue, and they bring him before the new proconsul Gallio, who is a brother of Seneca, a younger brother of Seneca, the Roman leader or Roman writer. And he's been newly appointed. Verse 13, they say that this fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. Verse 14, when Paul was now about to open his mouth, here's one time where God in his providence just protected Paul. He didn't have to say anything. Gallio said unto the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O ye Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look ye to it, for I will not judge of such matters. I'm no judge of these matters. Watch what happens here. And he drave them from the judgment seat. In other words, these Jews are bringing before him Paul, and he's, I don't want to get into these religious questions. Verse 17, though, is the verse. Then all the Gentiles, the Greeks, took Sosthenes, who must be the new leader of the synagogue, because the earlier one, Crispus, in verse 8, just got converted. So here's a new leader. And he must have gotten converted because he's part of Paul's introductory address to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 1:1. So he got them 1:2. The chief ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat, and Gallio cared for none of those things. Now here's what we have. We've got Gallio, a Gentile leader. We've got Jews here in this city. In Corinth, Paul stays here 18 months, a year and a half. We've got Jews that bring Paul before Gallio and want him to pass judgment on this matter. Gallio says, no, I'm not going to do that. Well, there's Gentiles around watching this little procession, and they're irritated at these religiously minded, bigoted, prejudiced Jews here wanting to judge this man. And so they take out their harshness, this latent anti-Semitism we've talked about, they take it out on the Jews by bringing their chief leader of the synagogue and beating him. And what does Gallio do? He cares for none of those things. Doesn't bother him. No one's concerned about the Jews. They took that as an opportunity because they already had latent in them the desire to punish these Jewish people here. And now when they see they've got a leader, Gallio, who is not favorably disposed toward the Jewish people at all, they know they can get away with anything if they do it to the Jewish people. And so right out of their heart comes this anti-Semitism. So tension from without. People don't like living around nonconformists. Now the Jewish scruples, here's another thing, we're still on without. Jewish scruples sometimes gave them a favored position with the Roman government. Jewish scruples sometimes gave them a favored position with the Roman government, such as exemption from military service because of Sabbath observance. Exemption from military service, and the Jews were exempt from military service because of Sabbath observance. How could you be in the military and you're out traveling on a campaign and it's time to fight and all of a sudden it's Saturday and you say, well, I'll tell you what, we can't fight today, but if you'll tell those guys to wait, we'll fight tomorrow. Well, you don't fight wars like that. So if you can't fight every day, you can't be in the army. And that's fine with the Jews. They didn't want to go to war anyway. They don't want to fight for a pagan land. So their scruple gave them a favored position with the Roman government. Now, what do you think the other Gentiles around those Jews think about them? They don't like that very well. You Jews with your bigots and your prejudices, I can't believe this. This little Sabbath observance of yours, I'm sure you invented that just so you wouldn't have to go to war. And we have to go to battle. That doesn't go over very well with the Gentiles living around them. Another source of tension from without them. Favoritism shown by the authorities. Favoritism shown to an imported, racially, religiously inferior people of all things caused the local people to be jealous. One writer states, and I quote, "The Jews were socially aloof, clannish, and proud of their heritage. In short, the Jews were different in every way, and they refused to conform. Nonconformity is the simplest and most common cause of antagonism in human relations." Pretty good observation, I think. Nonconformity is the simplest and most common cause of antagonism in human relations. As soon as you have someone around you who acts holier than thou and won't conform to what you're doing, well, you've got an antagonistic relationship immediately. I've had that throughout my religious life, being in a religious denomination and believing contrary to what they taught, being a chaplain as a charismatic in a Southern Baptist school. Nonconformity is the simplest and most common cause of antagonism in human relations. I didn't do anything, but that's it. I didn't do anything. I didn't conform. And if you don't conform, you're not liked. So a couple of more paragraphs in conclusion. In one sense, the Jewish people, here we have a dichotomy, were a stabilizing factor in any society where they work, in any locale. In one sense, the Jews were a stabilizing factor. We're just discussing their life and the tensions they experienced as diaspora Jews. In one sense, they were a stabilizing factor. Now here's what I mean by that. It's kind of their scruples turn around to their own advantage. Because the Jews were hated so much in some places, they disliked causing any trouble or turmoil at all, because that would point the spotlight on them more. Therefore, what they would tend to try to do is blend, not conform, but blend in and not cause any problems. And if they did that, what's an ideal citizen as far as the Roman government is concerned? Well, you can worship Yahweh or Jesus or whoever you want to worship. Just don't cause us any political, any military problems. You can do whatever you want to do. So in one sense, you see the Roman government, the official government, seems to kind of favor the people, at least in some places, because they're a stabilizing factor. The Jews are so disliked, they don't want to cause any trouble and thus bring on themselves more trouble. Friction unnecessarily caused was frowned upon as far as the Jewish leaders were concerned. Friction unnecessarily caused was frowned upon. So in one sense, they're a stabilizing factor. In another sense, though, they were reactionaries because they were nonconformists. So we're back to this tension, a dichotomous tension they're experiencing. In one sense, all they want to do is just be let alone, to live peaceably. Let's just follow the philosophy of live and let live instead of live and let die. We just all live together. Live and let live. But then there's another part of them that calls them to be reactionaries. But their revolutionary tendencies were primarily more pronounced in Palestine than out in the diaspora. After all, remember, this was their homeland, not the Romans. That's why leaders like Pilate had to be at Jerusalem, remember, at the annual festivals. What's he doing down there when his base is up at Caesarea Maritime? Why is he down there? He has to be at those annual festivals for fear of revolt. The Jews there in Israel, and especially in Jerusalem, were considered especially tumultuous. So we've got Jews as stabilizers, Jews as reactionaries. The stabilizing Jews were more the Jews of the diaspora. The reactionaries were more the Jews of Israel. And by the way, whenever war finally does erupt with Rome in AD 66, it of course begins and works its way through and finishes pretty much right in Israel. You don't have Jews all over the empire revolting, because that's not going to serve them really any purpose. They're living peaceably there already. The Jews in Israel, however, want their homeland back to them exclusively, and they're trying to throw off the Roman yoke. So the reactionaries are chiefly the Jews that live in Palestine. Now, if you will, just let me conclude with a few observations as far as Christians are concerned then. All that we've said thus far of the tension from within and from without is the exact same thing that the Christians of the first century would have faced, as well as ourselves. How to live a nonconformist, uncompromising life in a hostile environment. Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 2 in verse 15 that ye may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world. Now that was also the Jewish calling. And God in his providence used the Jews for that, although they didn't really know what was going on. 1 Peter 2 and verse 12. Having your life honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Surely we're talking about tension in a verse like this. A Christian living in a hostile environment, and yet he can't compromise. He can't conform. He has to live purely and uprightly and righteously there. And don't we even actually have a verse that contains the word itself? Romans chapter 12, verse 2, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We actually have the word there. The Jews were nonconformists, and Christianity is no different. Christianity is based in its Jewish Old Testament heritage. The same calling for the Jew has been placed upon the believer, that he is to be a nonconformist. Nonconformist, a separatist, not a purifier, a separatist, a nonconformist, one who does not compromise, one who does not conform. We have a verse, Romans 12, verse 2, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So I think that it is in this way that Peter could thus address Christians in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 1 as strangers scattered. The Christian diaspora. 1 Peter 1:1. In this way, Peter could thus address Christians as strangers scattered. Remember, this is where we have the Greek term diaspora, the scattering here. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Why would he address them as strangers scattered? Why would he address them as strangers? They're not strangers to him. They're fellow believers, joint heirs in Christ. Why would he address them as strangers? Because they're living as foreigners in a hostile environment. This isn't their home. Truly, this isn't their country. Truly, they are strangers, as is depicted of Abraham in Hebrews chapter 11, a wandering man who is passing through, looking for a city whose foundation and maker is God. And why use this technical Greek term diaspora, strangers scattered? Well, essentially, the same is true with the diaspora scattering term as with the stranger term. It's because you are a different, nonconformist people living in a hostile environment. And you see, Peter's a Jew. He knows exactly what the diaspora is all about. And notice that he's not writing to anybody in Palestine. He's writing to people up in Asia Minor. He lists some of the provinces: Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Asia proper, which is part of Asia Minor, and Bithynia. I mean, he would know as a Jew, that's diaspora territory. But I don't think that he's just writing, or maybe I don't think he's even primarily writing to Jewish people or to Jewish Christians. I don't think that's really what's on his mind here. I think what's on his mind is Christianity. Christians, whether they're Jew or Gentile, makes no difference. We're not talking about Jewish diaspora. That's the backdrop or the background that caused me to use this term. But I'm talking about Christians because whether you're a Christian Jew or a Christian Gentile, you're still a stranger scattered. Because, finally, if we'll end in Philippians 3, of what Paul teaches in Philippians 3 and verse 20. The Greek says, "For our citizenship is in heaven, from whence also we look for the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ." Philippians 3:20. "For our citizenship is in heaven, from whence also we look for the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall change our lowly body, that it may be fashioned like unto his glorious body, according to the working whereby he is able even to subdue all things unto himself." Well, it's pretty plain then what our calling is. Whatever we're going to learn and study about these Jewish people and about the diaspora here, we can make application, because I'm not just trying to get, some figurative reference or a typological allusion or something. Peter does it himself. Peter, he gives us apostolic authority for looking at the Jewish diaspora and making a comparison over into Christianity. He gives us apostolic authority in 1 Peter 1:1. I'm writing, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the strangers scattered. And so much of what he's talking about there, if you just go through his epistle, you can tell that at least many of the people to whom he's writing are Gentile Christians, although still I don't think that's the point. I think the point is he's writing to Christians. Whether they're Jews or Gentiles, they're truly part of the great diaspora in the heathen world out there. So remember that as we continue and go along here, whatever we're saying about these Jews, we have apostolic authority for finding some type of comparison over into Christianity. And if we didn't have that, just psychologically, you can see there's a comparison. The high tension existing between Jews living out there in the diaspora, between their desire to adhere to Mosaic law and the pull and the tug of the world on their coattails. The Christian experience is the same thing. And those that are more religiously, scripturally observant are those less easily assimilated into the world system. Those whose minds are more transformed are those who are less conformed to the world. Those who realize more about what and where their citizenship is, it is in heaven, have less interests here in the world, because this isn't your home. The Jews scattered all out there. The temptations are to fall into the worldly environment around. Some did. Some resisted that, because historically they had been nonconformist all along. That was just ingrained in them. And you think how different that makes you from someone out there in the world. That's ingrained in you as a Christian. I mean, I almost don't care where a person is saved, where they hear the message, and that initial message of salvation, when Jesus comes into your life, he changes you, and all of a sudden what you dislike drugs and alcohol and sex and filthy movies. Something just changes in you, and you dislike all of those things. What does that make you then? A nonconformist. And as a Christian, you and I, and in some churches you're raised with it more than in others. In churches that are more biblical, you're raised with it more than in others. But you have that heritage. You've been saved 5 or 10 years. You know you've just lived a tension-filled life because you have to live nonconformity. The world out there doesn't have to live like that. They just do whatever they choose to do, whatever they want to do. Whatever they like to do, whatever feels good, they're going to do it. They're not concerned about, is this conforming or not conforming? And that's the uppermost in the Christian's mind all the time. He's got that tension all the time. Is this conforming or is this not conforming? The world doesn't have to be concerned about that. Well, see, the Jews had to be concerned in the diaspora. The Gentile pagan neighbors around them didn't have to be concerned. The Jews did. Are we conforming? Compromising? Are we being transformed by the renewing of our mind, by those lessons that are being read to us every Sabbath day from Moses and the prophets? Is that doing us any good? So many times it didn't. They didn't put it into practice. They had other desires and other concerns and things they wanted to do and see in society. And because of that, they were blind to the law and the prophets. We dare not let that happen with us, as it happens in the church today.